Okay, now we're going to use a standard terrain and create an entirely custom material for our landscape. So I'm going to load in a standard terrain. I'm going to adjust our scale, make it a bit larger. What I also want to do is increase our resolution. I can just double click on our terrain, or we can right mouse click and edit object, and that will open up our terrain editor. And I'm just going to click ×2 twice so that we're up to 1024 by 1024 pixels. And that way we don't have as much geometry as we would with a procedural terrain, but we still have enough where we're not going to get any sort of rendering errors. And now we're going to double click on our material surface to bring up our advanced material editor. If you're in the basic, make sure you click on the advanced button to change that. We're going to start out with our color. So we're going to right mouse click, go to edit function, and we're going to work on this entirely within the function editor. So I'm going to open up our function output observer so that we can actually see our surface that we're creating. And just reposition our current nodes. What I'm also going to do is just delete our link to our alpha because we're not going to have any transparent surfaces for this. And I'm also just going to go ahead and just delete all of these current nodes because we're going to start entirely from scratch. So the first thing we want to do is just click in to create our red box, and I'm going to add our color node. Now currently this is set to color map, but I want to change this to our spline interpolation 3. And this is going to allow us to connect 3 separate colors, either defining specific colors, or we can actually connect these to other color nodes with specific functions and fractal nodes in order to create a really neat looking surface and really complex amount of shapes and colors all kind of combined together. And we have more than just this option for combining multiple colors. You can see we also have linear interpolation 3. And basically these just calculate and blend these different colors that we have in different ways. If we change this to 3 color output, now you see we have a first threshold and a second threshold amount that we can adjust. And that is the differences between color 1 and 2 and color 2 and 3. We can also link those to specific functions as well. But I'm going to change this back to our spline interpolation 3. And we're going to start working on the 3 color maps we want to use to create color 1, 2, and 3. Because instead of just using these solid colors, I'm going to connect these to actual color maps. So we're going to click off and add another color node, and I'm going to change this to color map. And we're just going to do that 2 more times. So we have a total of 3 color map nodes. And now each one of these I want to change and load in our gradients. So we're going to load a color map, and we'll select foliage for the first one. And our second one we can load in. And let's select green purple and click OK. And then we'll select our third one, and we can load in yellow, green, mauve. Click OK. Now you could customize these too if you want, but for the tutorial purpose, to keep it a little bit shorter, I'm just going to load in some of the pre-made custom ones. So now making sure that our setting is selected up here on the right, where we can see our connecting outputs, we can go ahead and connect this color node, which is our spline interpolation 3, to these other 3 nodes. So we can just go in here and select input 1, input 2, and input 3. And now we're not really going to see anything yet because each one of these gradients still aren't defined by an overall fractal. And our major color node too also needs to be connected to a specific fractal in order to get distribution between all 3 of our different materials. So we're just going to click in here and add a fractal. And I'm going to change this to Cellular Patterns Voronoi. Change our wavelength to 0.2 on all of our axes. And what I can also do is either connect this right away, or I could add a filter in between. I'm just going to go ahead and connect our first color map to this fractal, and now we can see our gradient showing up. But I also want to add a filter in between, so I'm just going to connect our link and just select our link and add a filter. And now we can select any of the number of filters. We also have environment sensitive filters, so we could adjust based on altitude, altitude and slope, orientation, environment, and patches. And now we also have a partial filter, which will allow us to create a regular filter, but adjust how much it really affects overall by using a filter ratio. And that can also be connected to another node. We can set this to sine wave if we want, and we can see we have a very harsh amount now. And if we take a look, we can really see the black and a nice bit of patches. So I'm going to stick with our sine wave, and we could adjust the contrast if we wanted to, and the overall effect of how that's going to look. And we can take a look just clicking on our color map and see exactly what that's going to look like. And those settings looks like they should be good, so we're going to stick with our sine wave, contrast of around 0.64, and our brightness of negative 0.38. And we could also select whether or not we'd like to show this in the graph so we can see that full filter. But I'm going to turn that off right now. And now we have our first color being created. Now, like I said, we're really not going to see anything just yet, so we need to work on the other ones. Our next color map, we want to add another fractal node for, and we can select any of the patterns, and there are so many available to produce just a lot of really neat effects. I could do spiral, and if I connect that right away, we'll see the gradient effect of that, which is pretty neat looking, but not quite what we're looking for. Go back to cellular patterns, I could select chipped, and now if we take a look at the chipped value, we really don't see an overall, or at least enough, of that specific surface. So we could either adjust the gain and decrease our roughness, or maybe pull our gain down just a little bit more. And now if we take a look, we still don't see a whole lot. So let's throw a filter on there. Select our link, and we can add our filter. Now by default it's using the last one we used, which is a sine wave, also with the exact same settings. But I want to use something else this time. Let's just use a standard filter. And I'm going to right mouse click, go to Edit Filter. If we can change this to Curves, just click anywhere in here to add a new key point, and then we can move that key point around and adjust how much of that surface we're seeing. So we really want to pay attention to our preview as we're working with this filter, because we can see how much of our gradient and how much of our color we're getting to see because of that. And as we move it through, we can also take a look at the actual color map node to see the shapes that it is creating. And depending on what kind of filter you have, how many points there are, you can achieve a lot of different results and a lot of different really cool looking effects. I'm going to stick with this filter, just about these settings, and now we can see the two color map nodes. If we also take a look at the main map, we can start to sort of see exactly what things are going to look like. But we still need to set our third map. So we'll go in here and we'll add another fractal. We can go to Math Patterns, select Leopard, if we wanted to have little dots everywhere and just little bits of this other one showing up. We can go to Square Patterns and we could do Random Altitudes, and now we can see just lots of blocks and squares, but a lot of them might not be best for working on terrains. We can change this to crystals under our cellular patterns. And let's just go ahead and connect that. And we'll want to adjust some of these values to really pull out as much color as we can out of that map. And if we need to, we can always add another filter. So now we can select this new filter, which is actually replicating the last one we made. But we can select any of these options. We have a quantize, which is really neat, which is basically like a solarized filter. And then we can adjust how many steps there are, and basically how many colors are creating this specific gradient. But overall, this is something that's really not going to blend together quite well. So we can go through, we have a saw wave, which will give us a very interesting looking effect, especially with the type of gradient that we have. If we take a look, we have very sharp cutoffs. We also have a clip mode that we can use, so we can clip out some of the higher colors, or we can pull that down with the overall contrast, and that way we can see a lot more of our gradient. And that should be good, so we're going to keep it about right there. And now I want to get a good look at our preview so far, so I'm going to connect our color to our Spline Interpolation 3 color map. And right now we really don't see anything except basically our second input. So what I want to do is connect this to another fractal so that we can control our distribution between all three of these different surfaces. So I'm going to click in here to get our red box, add another fractal, and now we want to choose the shape. I'm going to select the Voronoi from Cellular Patterns, which is a really nice one for creating terrains. I'm going to decrease our gain so that we can see more of the gray area. And I also want to adjust our wavelength, so it's a little bit different from the one we had set before. So we'll adjust our wavelength to 0.3 on all of our axes. And now we can connect our first node to our new fractal, and we can see the distribution between all of our different gradients. But overall, we're still not seeing a whole lot of the surface. So we can either edit our fractal, or we can add a new filter. And we'll select a partial filter, and we can edit that. Turn that into curves, add a new key point, and just modify that. And then also paying attention to the way our color looks, and also our function output observer. And we can just see how we're moving through each of the different gradients. We can click OK. Now this is just one method. Because this is a spline, we can move this to linear if we want. But we're going to have to reconnect. But now we can see it's a little bit different because it is calculated differently. We could also change that to just a 3-color output. And now we want to adjust and reconnect our 3 colors again. And we also have the ability now to adjust the first and the second threshold. And you can see as we adjust these amounts, we start to see our other gradients coming through. And if you wanted a different type of blend for this, what we could do is connect our first and second thresholds to additional nodes. I'm going to go back to our partial filter and just delete that, just so we're working with our main sections. And I'm going to add 2 more fractal nodes. Change this to Perlin Noise's value gradient, adjust our wavelength to 0.1, and now what we can do is just connect that first one, which we can see as our first threshold, and I'm going to create another one. And I'm going to use our crystals this time, and we can connect our second threshold to that. Oh, actually, we need to disconnect that and make sure we connect that to the correct node. And now we can see those thresholds showing up, but overall they're kind of overwriting things. So what we could always do is add a filter to this connection. And now we can see the effect of that partial filter. We could also use any of the available presets, and we could adjust that. But I'm going to switch this back to our spline interpolation 3. And I'm going to reconnect our colors. And now, because of the shapes of some of these, I'm going to adjust our filters so that we have a little better blend between our gradient. So we just want to take a look and have a nice blend. And we're looking at the function output to really see what the overall effect is going to look like. And that looks like it should be good for right now. So I'm going to click OK, and we're going to take a look at what this surface looks like with just our color. And what I also want to do is just scale down our overall surface to about 0.4 so we can see a lot more of what's going on. We could increase that if we needed to. But basically our functions that we're working with are kind of small, and because of the mapping mode we're using, it's changing our scale a little. So we can just adjust the overall scale to fit the size of our terrain. And let's take a look at a render. So we're going to right mouse click to open our render options, select Final, Render to Screen, and I'm going to render this at 640 by 480. Now we can see some rather large pixels on our overall terrain, and that's because we increased its resolution after the initial terrain was already created. So that is causing a lot of these different errors to show up, and we can correct that. I'm going to double click to open up our terrain editor, and I'm just going to select Mountain, and that's going to create a new shape for us, and we'll go ahead and re-render that. And we can see this one looks much better than the other render because we have a lot more definition. We're using our pixels to the full amount without having them being stretched because we're increasing the resolution after it was already created. But we can see overall just the base color map, little bits of green showing up, and just lots of little bits of our gradient all over our current mountain. So let's take a look at expanding this and make it a little more interesting. So we're going to go back into the Advanced Material Editor and back into our Function Editor. And what we want to do is add our bump map now, because that's going to give us the most amount of detail on our terrain, since we're just using a standard terrain and not a procedural. If I was to add this current color to a procedural terrain, since there's so much definition that's already in a procedural terrain, we wouldn't really have to worry about too much of a bump map on the actual surface. But let's take a look at actually creating our bump map, and we want this to be somewhat relative to the fractals that we're already using. So what I can do is use a combiner node, and we can connect a variety of these different fractals in order to create our overall bump map. And then we can add little bits of details beyond that. So let's just add our combiner. And I'm also going to zoom in so we can see this a little bit better. And currently we have our blender on. But since I want to use multiple surfaces, I'm going to change this to combiner. If you noticed, you also can see that we also have a color combiner, which will allow us to use this if we wanted to, instead of our color node, to combine these different materials. And that way we could adjust that based on one of these blending values, and also whether or not we'd like to allow luminous colors through. But I'm going to change this just to our combiner, because that's all we really need right now. And the combiner will allow us to connect to more than two surfaces, whereas if we're using the blender, we can really only connect two separate materials. And I want to use more than two. So go back to our combiner, and we're going to select each fractal that we'd like to use. Let's select our first, second, and third. And I could also throw on that one we're using for the overall distribution as well. And I could add any number of these, which is one of the nice things about the combiner node, is we can just blend as many as we want. So now we want to connect our bump directly to our combiner, and we can see that bump start to show up in our output observer. And the nice thing about using the ones we've already created is that they're already part of the color creation. So if we add to them to the bump, then it's going to separate our colors even more, and it's going to look even better. Now within our combiner, we can adjust the amplitudes and the offsets of each of our different inputs. And our inputs are our fractals that we have all of these connected to. So we can adjust the amplitude of one over the other. So if we wanted one bump to really show up more than another, we can adjust its amplitude. If we wanted to tone something down a little, we can just lower that amplitude. And then we can also adjust the offset. So I'm going to click OK with our new bump map created. And let's just go ahead and render that. And now we can see that nice bump map that we have added to this. And you could always adjust different amplitudes to create more of a bump from one of the fractals rather than some of the others, really depending on what it is you're trying to create. Now in this case, what I might actually want to do is just remove some of that green and just have a nice color blend between our separate sections. But overall, I think it looks pretty good. We can close this out and double-click to open up our material editor. And if we wanted, we could go to our bumps and we could turn on displacement mapping. And that's going to give us an even more realistic looking terrain. And we're going to be able to go beyond the geometry of that standard terrain and really make certain pieces of it come out. So now with displacement mapping turned on, we're just going to let that refresh. And now we can render that to see what it looks like with that displacement map. And we can definitely see with the displacement mapping on, the terrain does look much better, a lot more detail. It looks really good overall. We can see in some areas where it's starting to actually go down into our ground plane, and that's because we don't have the specific setting for that turned off, or actually checked on. But this did take a lot longer to render than a typical procedural terrain would take to render. So definitely something to keep in mind. We're going to go back, and we can see that displace outward only is not checked on, which is why we were going underneath our ground plane. I'm going to turn off our displacement mapping and click OK. And we'll let our terrain refresh. And we're going to go back into the function editor and take a look at some of the other settings. So one thing we can do is adjust and connect our highlight. So if we wanted one specific color as part of our terrain to have a little bit of specularity, we could easily just select our highlight and connect that directly to the node that is controlling the color for our specific area. So if we wanted some of these darker areas, which you can see with our second input, I could connect our highlight to that function, and we will notice a much higher highlight level or specular level for that specific area that's showing through. Now within that, we could also connect a filter if we wanted to be a little more exact about what it is we're editing. But let's go ahead and just delete that. We're going to take a look at making this surface a little more interesting by using turbulence nodes. So I'm just going to zoom in to our surface. And the first thing we want to adjust is our overall distribution of our three color maps. And I'm just going to move this off to the side, click in here to get our red box, and I'm going to add a turbulence node. I'm going to change this from simple to advanced, and that way we can specify our turbulence based on a noise node. Change it from cellular patterns, Voronoi, which is going to give us a really neat turbulent effect. And what we want to do is connect our origin directly to this turbulence. So our second node that we have, or our second connecting line, is going to be our origin. And if we leave the mouse over it, it will show up and highlight, so we make sure we have the correct one. We just hold that down and connect that directly to our turbulence. Now we can see that showing up within our turbulent in our actual fractal, and we can see that overall turbulent effect, and it's pretty neat looking. We can adjust the wavelength if we need to, maybe bring that down to 0.5 on all of our axes. And now we can see that showing up a little bit better. And if we also take a look, we can see we have with vortices on. And what this is going to do is just create nice little connections and blends between our twisting parts of our overall function. And now we can take a look at our terrain and see that it does look a lot more interesting with our overall color. Although our bump map is still being created in the same way it was before. Although we do have a small connection to this specific fractal as our fourth output. So we can increase the amplitude, and that way we would see more of that little bit of turbulence we have added. Or we could actually specify specific turbulence for this bump. But let's take a look at some of our other options. Let's go ahead and click over here to get our red box. We're going to add a math node. And we have a lot of different options for math nodes. If we open this up, we can see all of our available options. We've got some really neat ones in here, and a lot of them are very similar to the filters as well. And some of these are compatible with certain links, and some of them aren't. Basically, we can take a look and see what this is going to be compatible with by taking a look at the color of the link. We can see the color of this current sign is a blue color. And if we take a look at the links on the bottom, we can see that all of those are blue. That means we can use this math node, and it is compatible with all of our blue link connections. If we go into vector operations and select rotation and twist, we can see this is now a red line. And this link is specifically for working on our red connections and our red links. So we can further manipulate each of these options by using math nodes. And what I'm going to do is just disconnect this current link we have, select our fractal, connect it to our rotation and twist, and then connect rotation and twist to our position. So now we are rotating and twisting our specific fractal. If we go to edit, we can pick exactly which options we would like. We could rotate a little on the X, and now we can see that start to rotate. We could also twist this on our different directions to get something a little more interesting. And we can start to see that show up. Now, because we're working with so many nodes, it is difficult to see exactly what it is we're creating. And if you need to, you can always disconnect your connections for your main node where we have these extra links. So if you just want to focus on just this first one and what that's going to look like, you can disconnect these other two links and just highlight them, select them, and delete them. You can always reconnect them later. But now that we have this math node already in here, this allows us to see exactly which ones are going to be compatible. So if we open this up under vector operations, we can see that the majority of them are available, but some of them are not. Because these are going to be used for linking to our blue links. And if we open up our main, we can see we have conversions, where we have a couple available, and we can also use the multiply function. Now another thing we can do, if we take a look at the top in our input nodes, we notice we have normal, altitude, slope, orientation, and time. Now we can link a lot of these different options directly to some of these different settings. So if I wanted this specific material to actually be based on slope, what I can do is connect one of these specific areas to be connected to that. So if I wanted our roughness to be connected to the slope, I could just go to the right, or we can extract our roughness. And I'm just going to go in here and select our roughness from the side from all of our arrows. And then we can connect this to our slope. And we can see little blue circles showing up, which shows us that we're able to connect any of our blue links directly to slope, orientation, altitude, and time. Our red connections, we will not be allowed to do that. So now we can see our roughness of this specific area is directly connected to our slope. We can see on the higher areas it is very rough, and then once we start to get to the lower amounts of slope, we don't notice any roughness at all. And if we need to control this a little bit further, what we can always do is add a fractal, or a filter node. Of course, we can always control certain filter nodes with fractals, so that is possible too. So we can choose a number of the different available fractals that we have, or filters that we have, or we can customize a specific filter. We can use a lot of these different settings. We could do opposite. And with opposite, what we're going to notice is that we have more roughness on the bottom and then a lot more smoothing on top. And like I said, we're also using a very large function right now where we're combining several different colors. So the immediate effects of this we're not going to see all over our terrain, just in the specific areas where this color is showing through. We could change that to a saw wave, and you can see the immediate effects of that. And basically by looking at our overall color, we can tell how our slope is being adjusted. We can change that to absolute. And now we can also modify specific connections to other fractals as well. For the absolute mode, we have a contrast and a threshold. So if we needed to, we can connect these values to other functions, and that'll produce entirely different results. What I can also do is just go ahead over here and adjust and connect this directly to our altitude. And I'm going to change this to a filter. And now we can see the original gradient that is being created, where we have white on top and black on the bottom. And then we can adjust our filter and how it affects this specific node. Because if we take a look, we can see it's a very sharp contrast between the two. But if we edit the filter in specific ways, we can go ahead and change exactly how that's going to be reflected. And every filter is going to give us a different result. And in this case, while working with altitude, we're really not going to notice an overall blend. And we can see a very sharp line. And as we start to move this through, we can see two lines. And we can change that if needed. We can just hit the X on that to close that out. And we're going to delete that filter. And I'm also going to delete our connection. But we can easily adjust any of these for any of the settings to specific areas. So if I wanted this fractal over here on the right, which is basically our third color input, I could have our largest feature directly connected to our slope. So depending on the slope, we can have larger areas or smaller areas directly connected to that. And if we add any filters in between, we'll be able to adjust that as well. And we can also add math nodes in there too that are compatible with our blue links. And basically the best way is just to click to get that red box, add in whatever nodes you're hoping to look at. If you select a math node, then you can go in here and click, and now we can see invert. We have the ability to use with any of our blue connections. Our sine wave we can use with any of our blue connections. Some of our conversions are not going to be available, and with some of these other settings where we have Decomposer 3, we can see that this is a red connection, so we would have to use this for our connections in between our position or any of the major red links. We would delete that. And we can take a look at some of other options. Go ahead and click to get our red box. We can add a color node. Now we can change this to any of these different color corrections. We have the HLS shift, which gives us a hue, luminosity, and saturation. These can be connected, as we can see, with blue connections, so we'll be able to connect these to fractals and a variety of different filters. And then we can adjust this color, which we can see is green, which means we'd have to adjust this directly to one of our colors. But this means we'd be able to adjust our color separately. And I'll just go ahead and select our second one. And now we can adjust the hue and the overall color without actually affecting our original node and our original gradient. And you can see that we can change this to a variety of different colors. And we can get some different types of effects because of that. And this also isn't really connected to anything else other than just this node. So we'd want to make sure that if we were going to use this, that we would make it between our connection. So in this case, if I wanted this to really look purple like that, I could delete our link. And now I'm going to delete our link to our second, connect that to our shift, and then we can reconnect that. And now our purple is going to show up, and we can start to see that in our material. So it's a really easy way to change our color. We also have other options. We can do a brightness and contrast. We can increase the overall brightness of that color. We can also set up a filter where we have a filter color, and we can either connect that directly to another color, or we could connect it to a gradient, just as we did with these other colors. We also have a color shift, which is just an overall color shift. Perspective, where we have a perspective color, and we can see that showing up. So we can use a variety of these to control beyond the initial gradients that we have selected. And by adding filters and math nodes to that as well, we can achieve some really interesting looking results. So I'm just going to leave it right now and click OK. And now we're just going to render this out and take a look. One thing I'm going to do is actually go back into our material editor really quick and increase our diffusion. And that'll give us a little bit of a brighter terrain. And I could also go to our atmosphere editor, go to light, and just make it a little bit brighter for our intensity. Click OK, and now we can render that out. Now we can see we have a fairly basic looking terrain with a lot of detail and a lot of different options. And of course we can use our mixed materials or add other layers to this to make it a little more interesting. But this is just one basic, simple material that we've created. You can of course change these settings to however you want to get a lot of different color options. If we needed to, we could always bring down that bump a little, either by using a filter before our combiner that we have set up, or we can just go into our settings and reduce that. So let's just close that out and take a look at our advanced material editor. And what we could do for the bump is either just reduce our depth, and we could just bring that down a little. And now we notice a lot less definition from that bump map, and we're not going to see as much definition on our actual terrain. Now the other way we could adjust that is either by using the filter directly within our bump production, just bringing down that right side, or we could go into Edit Function, and our link between our bump and our combiner, we could add a filter to that. We could also use that filter to modify a couple of other things as well, because we can see that overall we're very much towards certain surfaces. We have a lot of white areas, so if we needed to, we could add a filter to that. And then if I edit our filter, turn on our curves, maybe add a new key point, and then we could adjust our overall bump in that manner. And now you can see we have a very interesting looking surface where we have some flatter areas that are sort of being clipped out. but it does give a really neat looking surface. So that's what you're going for, then this is a very easy way to achieve that. We could just bring that down a little further. And also paying close attention to our actual node itself and how this color is being changed based on the current settings. So I'm just going to exit out of that. And we could change this filter to something else. We could do a sine wave, which is really going to raise up certain areas, especially around the rims of our colors. And we get a pretty neat looking surface that way. And click OK. And let's just go ahead and render that with our lower bump settings and just that little bit of a sine filter. And now we can really see why those bumps and using those fractals for specific colors are also good with bumps, because we have this nice outline around specific colors. So if we want to isolate our colors that way, adding that sine filter will raise up the outer edges. And now if I wanted these specific green sections to really be related to certain slope aspects, and whether or not we just want it on the tops of certain areas or on the slope, the best way to really do that would be to change this green to match with some of our other colors. And we could probably change that, maybe make it a little bit smaller so there's a lot more variation in there. And then we could just add another material layer that would be based on this green color. And then we could influence the environment by either using the Environment tab or a Mixed Material to specify exactly where we'd like to have that on areas of our terrain. And it's just much easier to separate color values for environmental effects by using the Environment tab and multiple materials rather than doing it within the function editor with a simple material. So basically, when you're creating a lot of your terrain materials, you'll want to keep them around the same color, maybe little bits of variation, but the overall changes you'll want to have as separate materials that you can just easily blend together.